The icy wind of the Baltic Sea at the end of January 1945 didn't just sting the skin. It seemed to cut through the very fabric of reality, reminding everyone on board the enormous vessel that night that the world around them was utterly collapsing. In the pitch-black darkness, where the sky merged with the heavy, leaden waves, the giant silhouette of the liner Wilhelm Gustloff appeared as a ghostly island of hope for thousands fleeing the advancing roar of the Eastern Front. Inside this floating city, designed in peacetime for 1,500 passengers, there were now, by various estimates, 6,000 to 10,000 people crowded together. People occupied every free inch of the decks, corridors, and even drained swimming pools. The air was thick with the smell of fear, sweat, and cheap tobacco. And somewhere deep below, beneath the steel hull, in the icy abyss, lurked a threat that no one on board could see. At that very moment, just a few miles away, through the periscope's eyepiece, a man whose name would soon become a symbol of one of the most discussed events in naval history looked at the brightly lit liner. Alexander Ivanovich Marinesko, commander of the submarine S-13, saw in the crosshairs not just a ship, but a target that was to decide not only the outcome of his personal confrontation with fate, but also to write a new, tragic, and at the same time, heroic page in the annals of the Great Patriotic War. To understand how these 2 points in space, a Soviet submarine and a German ocean giant, converged in a fateful duel, one must go back several years, to an era when the Wilhelm Gustloff was the pride of the Third Reich. Built as a symbol of social well-being and accessible recreation for workers, this liner cruised the seas for several years, embodying the slogan, "Strength through joy." However, with the outbreak of the large-scale global conflict in 1939, its snow-white sides changed color to the strict gray of the military fleet. The ship was transformed into a floating barracks, and then into a training base for submarine specialists. By the beginning of 1945, the situation for Germany in the east had become critical. The Red Army was rapidly approaching the borders of East Prussia, and the only way to salvation for millions of people was the sea. Operation Hannibal, launched on the orders of Admiral Karl Donitz, became the largest evacuation in human history, and the Wilhelm Gustloff was to play a key role in it. However, the status of the ship at this point was extremely ambiguous. On the one hand, thousands of civilian refugees, women and children seeking salvation, were on board. On the other hand, it was a full-fledged auxiliary naval vessel, carrying anti-aircraft weaponry and hundreds of trained submariners ready to continue participating in hostilities. Meanwhile, on the Soviet side, Alexander Marinesko was in an extremely difficult position. The commander, possessing the talent of an outstanding submariner, but with a reputation as a man of difficult character and a tendency to violate discipline, realized that the current combat mission could be his last chance for rehabilitation in the eyes of the command. His submarine S-13 went to sea in mid-January 1945, when the ice conditions in the Baltic were extremely severe. The crew literally had to break through shore ice and maneuver in conditions of limited visibility. Marinesko was looking for a large prize that could justify all the risks and prove his exceptional effectiveness. His tactics were always marked by audacity. He preferred to attack from a surfaced position, using high speed and the element of surprise, which, in the context of the enemy's saturated anti-submarine defenses, bordered on recklessness. But it was precisely this recklessness, multiplied by precise calculation, that led him to the point where the interests of two warring sides collided with incredible force. The external contour of this conflict was built upon the strict laws of war of that time. On January 30th, 1945, the Wilhelm Gustloff left the port of Gotenhafen. The sailing conditions were far from ideal. The frost reached 18 degrees, the sea was stormy, and the liner's escort consisted of only one destroyer, the Löwe, and a small minesweeper. The huge mistake of the German command was that the ship sailed with its navigational lights on, due to the fear of collision with other German ships in the thick fog. This light attracted the attention of Soviet submariners. From the perspective of international maritime law, the situation was unequivocally for wartime. The ship had no hospital ship markings, was painted in camouflage, carried weaponry, and was part of a convoy. This made it a legitimate military target. Marinesko decided to attack from the shore side, where the depth was shallower, and where German acousticians least expected the enemy's appearance. This was a masterful maneuver, requiring the crew of S-13 to perform with jeweler's precision in controlling the submarine on the surface in heavy seas. When at 21 hours and 8 minutes Moscow time, the first torpedo, inscribed "For the Motherland," left the tube, the countdown to the giant liner's last moments began. The second and third torpedoes, "For Leningrad" and "For the Soviet People," also hit their targets. The fourth torpedo got stuck in the tube, almost creating a critical situation for the submarine itself. But the crew's professionalism averted disaster. The hits struck the bow, the pool area where auxiliary services were located, and the engine room. Powerful explosions instantly deprived the ship of propulsion and electricity. Chaos erupted inside the liner, impossible to describe in simple words. Thousands of people were trapped in dark corridors, rapidly filling with icy water. Those on the upper decks faced a new problem. Due to icing, the lifeboats were frozen solid to the davits, and lowering them into the water in severe alist was practically impossible. The internal dimension of this tragedy unfolds through the fates of specific individuals. Aboard the Wilhelm Gustloff were 4 captains, each with his own vision of how the ship should be handled. These disputes and the lack of unified command at a critical moment only exacerbated the consequences of the attack. Among the passengers were thousands of women with children fleeing the horrors of the land war, hoping to find peace in the West. For them, the enormous ship was a symbol of protection, which, in the blink of an eye, turned into a deadly trap. Submarine sailors from the 2nd Training Division, who were on board, tried to organize an evacuation, but the scale of the disaster exceeded any instructions. Many of them ended their lives in the icy waters of the Baltic, never reaching their new submarines. For Marinesko himself, this moment became the peak of his military career. He acted coolly, understanding that before him was not just transport, but a powerful enemy military resource. His personal drama was that, having accomplished a feat later called the attack of the century, he did not receive the recognition he expected during his lifetime. His character and independence continued to conflict with the bureaucratic system, which led to him being awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union only posthumously, decades after the end of the war. The ideological and philosophical conflict of the event in the icy waters of the Baltic goes far beyond tactical schemes and casualty lists. Here, 2 systems of values, 2 views on morality in total war, clashed. On the one hand, an undeniable fact: the destruction of a ship carrying enemy submarine personnel was a severe blow to Germany's military potential. The loss of nearly 1,000 trained specialists meant that dozens of German submarines would not be able to put to sea and would not harm Allied convoys. From this point of view, Marinesko's actions were impeccably effective and strategically justified. However, the presence of a huge number of civilians on board poses a complex ethical question for historians and descendants. Can the death of non-combatants be justified by strategic necessity? In 1945, when the world had already experienced the horrors of blockades, city bombings, and mass exterminations, the line between military and civilian targets became transparent. The Wilhelm Gustloff became a victim of the logic of war, in which victory is achieved by any means, and human life turns into a statistical unit in command reports. The paradox is that this liner, created for joy, became the site of one of the most massive single-moment losses of human lives in the history of navigation. A turning point in the perception of this story was the realization of the scale of what happened after the smoke of battle cleared. German propaganda of the time tried to use the tragedy to raise the spirit of resistance, portraying the attack as an act of unmotivated cruelty. In the Soviet Union, on the contrary, this event was spoken of very sparingly for a long time. The information vacuum contributed to the birth of myths and legends on both sides. Only decades later, when archival documents and testimonies of the few survivors became available, the picture began to clear up in its entirety. It turned out that the rescue operation launched by the German fleet was heroic in its essence. Under the threat of new torpedo attacks, small ships snatched people from the icy water, risking their own existence. Out of 10,000 people, only about 1,230 managed to survive. These figures became a silent reproach to humanity, which allowed the ocean to turn into a giant graveyard. The transformation of Marinesko's perception in the eyes of society also went a long way, from an inconvenient hero to a legendary submariner, whose actions are studied in naval academies around the world as an example of exceptional courage and professionalism. The culmination of the events of January 30th, 1945, came at the moment when the stern of the Wilhelm Gustloff finally disappeared under the water. A huge funnel for a moment swallowed the remnants of hope of those who still remained on the surface. At that moment, a point was put in the history of the Baltic which still causes disputes and discussions. All streams of meaning, military necessity, personal ambitions, human suffering, and international law, converged at one geographical coordinate. This was not a clash of two ships, it was a clash of two worlds. Marinesko and his crew, successfully escaping from the pursuit of German destroyers that dropped dozens of depth charges, felt triumph. They accomplished a task that no one else could. For those who fought for life in the icy waves, it was the end of their personal world. The distance between the triumph of some and the end of life of others that night was measured only by the thickness of the submarine's steel hull and the temperature of the overboard water. Today, the resonance of the S-13 submarine attack continues to be felt in historical science and public consciousness. The lessons of this event are important not only for military historians, but for each of us. First and foremost, it is a reminder of how dangerous the blurring of lines between military and civilian targets can be. The tragedy of the Wilhelm Gustloff teaches us that in a global conflict, thousands of innocent people become hostages to the decisions of politicians and commanders. In the modern world, where technologies allow for pinpoint strikes, the question of responsibility for civilian lives is even more acute. We must understand that every action in war has long-term consequences that extend beyond the immediate moment. The philosophical lesson is that even in the most brutal confrontation, humanity must strive to preserve remnants of humanism, so that after the conflict ends, we can look each other in the eye. The memory of this tragedy serves as a warning against the romanticization of war and reminds us of its true face, a face of pain, loss, and unavoidable moral dilemmas. Summarizing this dramatic narrative, we return to the beginning, to the icy wind and the dark waters of the Baltic. Alexander Marinesko, looking through the periscope, saw the enemy, a symbol of the Third Reich's power. He acted as a soldier of his time, honestly and fully performing his duty. The Wilhelm Gustloff, with all its passengers, became part of the colossal price humanity paid for the madness of the mid-20th century. This event cannot be unequivocally assessed using only categories of black and white. It is a deep, multifaceted tragedy where the feat of one is inextricably linked with the end of the life's journey of many others. History does not give us simple answers, but it forces us to think, empathize, and draw conclusions. The Baltic Sea carefully guards its secret at a depth of 45 meters, where the steel skeleton of the once majestic ship still rests. This monument beneath the water's surface is an eternal reminder that even in the darkest times, the human spirit strives for light, and the price of mistakes on a historical scale is measured in thousands of fates, vanished into eternity under the roar of torpedo salvos and the sound of stormy surf. Reflecting on the events of that night, January 30th, 1945, we involuntarily ask ourselves, was there another way? Could events have unfolded differently if the navigation lights had remained off, or if the convoy had been more formidable? History does not tolerate the subjunctive mood, but it demands that we recognize responsibility for the future. Marinesko's feat remains in the annals as an example of unprecedented skill, and the demise of the Wilhelm Gustloff as one of the saddest pages in maritime history. These two facts exist in parallel, not canceling but complementing each other, creating a complex and contradictory picture of the reality of 45. When we look at modern maps of the Baltic Sea, the point of the liner's sinking is marked as a burial site, where all diving and work are prohibited. This is an acknowledgement of the sanctity of a place where people of different nationalities, ages, and beliefs found their final resting place. Thus, the sea, which once divided and posed a threat, today calls for peace and the preservation of memory, which must be stronger than any conflict. Continuing to examine the significance of this historical episode, one cannot help but touch upon the theme of the human factor, which proved decisive that night. The actions of the S-13 crew were a model of coordination and discipline. Every sailor, every officer aboard the Soviet submarine understood that not only the success of the attack, but also their own survival depended on their work. In the confined space of the boat, saturated with the smell of diesel fuel and moisture, people worked at the limit of their capabilities. Their resolve was fueled by years of the most severe trials that had befallen their country. For them, the destruction of a huge enemy transport was an act of retribution and a step towards long-awaited peace. On the other hand, people aboard the liner also displayed miracles of resilience and self-sacrifice. History has preserved stories of those who gave their life jackets to others who until the last moment tried to help children and the elderly. In these manifestations of the highest human spirit, arising at moments of absolute despair, lies the true meaning of humanity, which no time can erase. The technical side of the attack of the century also deserves detailed consideration. Marinesko used tactics that later became textbook examples as attack from around the corner. Approaching from the shore in shallow waters meant exposing the submarine to an enormous risk of visual detection or running aground. But it was precisely this calculation on the enemy's psychological unpreparedness that worked. German acousticians on the Lohe and Gustloff searched for propeller noises from the open sea, considering the coastal zones safe. Furthermore, the low water temperature affected the density of the medium, which changed the acoustic picture. These nuances, which Marinesko felt intuitively, allowed the S-13 to approach to a distance of an ideal shot, about 4 cable lengths. The accuracy of 3 torpedoes hitting a vessel of such size testifies to the highest level of training of the torpedo operators. This was technical perfection put at the service of military necessity, demonstrating the power of Soviet engineering thought and the professionalism of the sailors. The subsequent days after January 30th became a time of realization of the catastrophe's scale at Hitler's headquarters. There is a legend that the Führer declared Marinesko his personal enemy, although documentary evidence for this is extremely scarce. Nevertheless, the blow was so sensitive that mourning was declared in Germany. The loss of so many future submarine crews effectively meant the paralysis of the program to resume unlimited submarine warfare in the Atlantic. New types of submarines, which were supposed to turn the tide of naval battles, remained at the piers without trained personnel. This saved the lives of thousands of Allied sailors and accelerated the end of the conflict in Europe. Thus, the actions of one Soviet submarine had a global strategic effect, comparable to the success of an entire ground operation. This underscores the role of personality in history and shows how one bold decision can change the course of world events. The fate of Alexander Marinesko himself after January 30th was tragic and paradoxical. Upon returning to base, he did not receive the expected full scope of awards. Conflicts with superiors, his straightforwardness, and unwillingness to adapt to the system led to his achievements being effectively silenced for many years. After the war, he was discharged from service, changed several professions, faced everyday difficulties and unjust accusations. His life became a reflection of the lot of many heroes who, in peacetime, proved to be unnecessary to the state they had defended. However, popular memory proved stronger than official orders. Submarine sailors passed down stories of his feat by word of mouth, and ultimately, justice prevailed. Today, monuments to Marinesko stand in Kronstadt, Odessa, and St. Petersburg, and streets and schools bear his name. This proves that true heroism does not require instant approval. It passes the test of time and remains in people's hearts. The investigation into the causes of the high mortality rate during the liner's sinking reveals new facets of this tragedy. An insufficient number of life-saving appliances, panic, blocked exits, and an incredibly rapid loss of the ship's stability were factors that left people no chance. Many of those on board died not from explosions but from hypothermia in water whose temperature was close to zero. In such conditions, the human body can resist for only a few minutes. The few who were rescued carried psychological trauma with them for the rest of their lives. This reminds us that any military victory has its shadow, its bitter underside. We must remember the victims of the Wilhelm Gustloff, not to condemn the actions of the submariners, but to understand the terrible price the world pays for its inability to resolve conflicts peacefully. International maritime law concerning the status of vessels in wartime underwent significant changes after this incident. The tragedy in the Baltic became one of the precedents discussed during the improvement of the Geneva Conventions. The question of when a vessel with refugees loses its inviolability became the subject of detailed legal disputes. Today, standards require a clear separation of civilian and military transport flows, and the marking of hospital ships and humanitarian corridors has become a mandatory and strictly controlled procedure. This is a direct consequence of the bitter lessons humanity learned from the events of 45. We have learned to create rules that should minimize casualties among the civilian population, although the reality of modern conflicts often poses new challenges to these rules. Concluding our historical excursion, we see that the attack on the Wilhelm Gustloff remains one of the most powerful triggers for discussing the topic of war and morality. This event continues to stir writers, directors, and historians. Günter Grass, in his novella Crab Walk, attempted to comprehend this tragedy through the prism of German memory, acknowledging the complexity and ambiguity of what happened. In Russia, this story remains a symbol of the indomitable will and skill of Soviet sailors. These different perspectives do not necessarily have to be at odds. On the contrary, their dialogue allows us to see the full picture, where heroism coexists with grief and strategic success with personal loss. The truth here is not to choose one side, but to recognize the right to exist of the full spectrum of human experience in that terrible era. In the end, the story of S-13 and her commander is a story of choice. A choice between risk and safety, between order and a sense of justice, between life and the end of one's path. On that January night, Alexander Marinesko made his choice, which forever changed his life and entered world history. The liner Wilhelm Gustloff, in turn, became a symbol of the collapse of an entire empire that built its well-being on the pain of others. Today, as we look at the calm waters of the Baltic, it is important for us to remember that beneath this surface lie not only shipwrecks, but also lessons that we are obliged to remember. The memory of those events should serve us not as a reason for new enmity, but as a foundation for understanding how fragile peace is and how great is each person's responsibility for their actions before eternity. Thus, the narrative circle closes, returning us to the image of the periscope and distant lights on the horizon. That moment on January 30th, 45th, remains a moment frozen in time of the highest tension of human forces and destinies. We leave this story with a deep understanding that truth is often more complex and painful than any myths. But it is in this complexity that the true greatness of history lies, which teaches us to value every moment of life and to strive so that the icy waters of the seas never again witness such tragedies. May the memory of Marinesko and the thousands of nameless passengers of the Gustloff live in us as a warning and as a call to wisdom, mercy, and the eternal search for truth in the labyrinths of the past.